Hello, Longhorns. Today we're going to talk about contrapositive. Okay, so let me move my little face out the way real quick. Okay, so let's refresh some of the things that you've already covered as far as conditional statements. So a conditional statement is an if-then statement. So we refer to the if part as the P, and the then part after that is the Q. So the hypothesis is the P part, following the if, and the conclusion is the part Q following the then. So I wrote you some kind of references right here for all the statements that we've covered so far. Conditional statements, converse, inverse, and biconditional. And I show you how the P and the Q, hypothesis and conclusion, reverse places in the sentences. So for example, our conditional statement, which is the one we usually work with, if P, then Q. So we represent it by the P with the arrow to Q. Converse, we had if Q, then P. So the conclusion and the hypothesis were reversed, and we have the symbols to follow. Inverse, we simply add a not. If not P, then not Q. And it is represented by the symbol, little symbol right here that represents negating. We'll cover that in a second, just to make sure you know what that means. And finally, we have biconditional. If P and only if Q, that is represented by P, and then there's an arrow going both ways, which means it can go both directions, and then Q. Okay, so let's look at counterpositive. Counterpositive is a conditional reverses the order of the hypothesis and the conclusion and negates them both. So here's our symbols, how we use. You see our conclusion, our Q, is coming before our P. Now let's refresh our memories on what this little symbol right here means. Negate. Negate means to have the opposite meaning of the original statement. So to make it simple, we're just going to say the simple negate right here means not. Okay? So let's do some examples. So our first conditional statement is, if you study, then you will get a good grade. So I like to underline my hypothesis. So write everything after the if, and then I underline my conclusion would be after the then statement. So let's think about that statement. Is that a true statement? If you study, then you get a good grade? That's pretty true. Okay, so let's do a converse of that statement. If you get a good grade, then you studied. So let's underline, remember the converse, we underline the conclusion first, keep my line blue, and then you studied, which is our hypothesis. So let's think about that. Sometimes you could get a good grade just because you're good at the subject or because the test was really easy. Doesn't always mean because you studied. So I'm going to say that that's not true. Okay? Inverse. Now remember, for our inverse statements, we're add not, the word not to it. If you don't study, then you will not get a good grade. So let's underline. There's our hypothesis. There's our conclusion. So let's think about that. If you don't study, then you pretty much are pretty certain not to get a good grade. But you never know, right? It's possible that you could get a good grade, just like we said, just because you're good at it. So we're going to say that that's not true. Finally, we have the counterpositive, which is a combination of the converse right here and the inverse. So we switch the conclusion and the hypothesis, and we're adding a not like we did on the inverse. So we have, if you do not get a good grade, then you did not study. So let's underline our conclusion and then our hypothesis. So I think that's true. So do you notice that our conditional and our counterpositive are both true in this case? Let's talk about that. So Conditional and counterpositives have the same truth value. So if a condition is true, then the counterpositive of that statement is also true. Okay? Let's do another example. If two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So let's use our angle vocabulary that we learned. What do we know about the words supplementary angles and linear pair? Well, let's back up to and work on our hypothesis. Underline that, and let's underline our conclusion. Okay, so now let's go back to our angles. Okay, so we know supplementary angles mean they're equal to 180. We also know a linear pair is also equal to 180, but they share an adjacent line. Okay? So I'm going to say that that's true. And I even drew a little drawing for us. Okay? Let's do the converse of this. If two angles are supplementary, then they form a linear pair. Let's underline everything. There's our conclusion. And there's our hypothesis. So let's think about what we know again about supplementary angles. Could we have something like this, where these two angles equal to 180, but they're not sharing in an adjacent line? Yes, we could, right? That's what. So in this case, this statement is not true. Inverse. Now we're going to add a not to our statement. If two angles do not form a linear pair, then they are not supplementary. Underline our hypothesis and underline our conclusions. If two angles do not form a linear pair, they are not supplementary. So that's not true because, as we said, there could be supplementary angles right there. Okay, counterpositive. So we're going to switch P and Q, so our conclusion and our hypothesis places, and then we're going to negate them both. Okay, so if two angles are not supplementary, then they don't form a linear pair. Okay, so underline our two statements, and let's think about that again. Well, if they're not 180 degrees, then there's no way they form a linear pair, right? So this is true. So back to our value, our conditional statement and our counterpositive statement. If our conditional statement is true, then our counterpositive statement is true. Okay? So now I've gone back and added this to our little reference table that we had earlier. So now you can see I've added our counterpositive for your reference. So if not Q, then not P. Okay? There's our symbols. All right? So that's all we're going to talk about counterpositive today. Have a great one. Talk to you later.